Madam President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I would ask to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. You know, we're today here debating the issue of rules, and I've listened to this debate about the Senate rules, and the word broken gets tossed around a lot. Broken agreements, breaking the rules to change the rules, those are the sideline comments. And they miss the real point, because what is broken is the Senate itself. I've said for a long time, the Senate is a graveyard for good ideas. And the shovel is unprecedented abuse of filibusters, of delay and obstruction. It all adds up to one thing: broken. We called for changes in the Senate rules at the beginning of this Congress. We should have put in place a talking filibuster and other changes, but we didn't. So we have this tyranny of the minority, where the minority governs, just the situation that our founding fathers feared. Too often the Senate is still a graveyard for good ideas, and the bodies just keep piling up, especially with executive branch nominees. In January, the two leaders agreed, and I'm quoting here from what they said on the floor, to work together to schedule votes on nominees in a timely manner by unanimous consent, except in extraordinary circumstances. The minority leader said, on the subject of nominations, Senate Republicans will continue to work with the majority to process nominations consistent with the norms and traditions of the Senate. That was the agreement, and it has not been kept. The only extraordinary circumstance has been continual obstruction, and it all began very early on. For openers, we saw the filibuster of Chuck Hagel's nomination, the first time a Secretary of Defense was ever filibustered. But this is part and parcel for President Obama's cabinet secretaries. By way of comparison, looking at other presidents, not one of President Carter's cabinet nominees was filibustered. President H.W. Bush, 0. President Reagan, 1. President George W. Bush, 1. President Obama, 4, and still counting. I'm old enough to remember the era when my father was Secretary of Interior in the Kennedy administration and Johnson administrations. When I joined the Senate, I told my dad when I went home one of the weekends, we can't get executive nominees in place. The President and the Cabinet Secretaries don't have their teams in place. He said, Tom, I had virtually my whole team in place in the first 2 weeks. Imagine that. Imagine if the whole team for the Department of Interior, or any other department for that matter, was confirmed in the first 2 weeks. Agencies could function. Our government could do its work. Instead, the President's nominations are ambushed by filibusters. Confirmation now almost always requires 60 votes, contrary to the historical practice of the Senate. And more importantly, contrary to the explicit simple majority requirement in the U.S. Constitution. This is not the traditions and norms the Republicans committed to. It is anything but. Still, that is what we have seen. One nominee after another blocked and key leadership posts left unfilled. Americans thought they spoke with a clear voice last November. No doubt they now wonder. And why wouldn't they? The will of the majority is drowned out by a small minority. People in my home state of New Mexico want to know, Americans want to know, who is minding the store? The answer, in too many cases, is no one. We still don't have a Secretary of Labor. The National Labor Relations Board is an empty shell. The Senate has failed to confirm a full 5-member board and general counsel. 2 of these nominees are Republicans, even though they couldn't get through. This has real impact for 80 million Americans who rely on workplace protections, for the rights of workers and the integrity of the collective bargaining process. Some believe this is a good thing, that we toss out the enforcement of labor law in this country. I don't share that view. But it isn't just workers who are left hanging. Leadership positions at other vital agencies remain unfilled. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the Federal Election Commission. These are important jobs, important work for the American people, affecting the environment, consumers, health care, and even our elections. Earlier this year, we debated gun safety legislation. Republicans argued that we don't need new laws, that we just need to enforce the existing laws. Unfortunately, the agency responsible for enforcing many of those laws, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, has not had a Senate-confirmed director in 7 years. Why? Because Republicans do not want the ATF to function. Many of these highly qualified Americans get tired of having their lives put on hold because of partisan obstruction. Rather than continue to languish in a dysfunctional system, they withdraw from consideration. One such example was Don Johnson, nominated to head the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. Johnson was a respected law professor and former top assistant in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Clinton administration, but Republicans blocked her nomination. In 2010, after her nomination was stalled in the Senate over a year, she withdrew. Another example is Peter Diamond. In 2011, he withdrew as President Obama's nominee to the Federal Reserve Board. Diamond's nomination was blocked because a small minority of senators questioned whether he was qualified. I tend to believe that he was, as he won the Nobel Prize in economics the year before. It makes you wonder why anyone would subject themselves to a Senate confirmation. People who want to serve their country, often at a significant pay cut from their private sector careers, but know they will be subjected to a partisan fight that they may have nothing to do with their qualifications. So months and years go by. Work is left undone, with no one at the helm of major government agencies. And that is why the Senate is in crisis. That is why we are here today. The American people deserve better than this. We need a government that does its job. That's not possible without leadership. Congress's approval ratings remain in the cellar. Why? Because of a failure to get things done. Even things as basic as allowing the President to select his own team. Find 60 votes or find someone else or leave the position empty. This is the status quo, and it must change. It's time for us to act. It's time to restore the confirmation process. Restore it to how it has worked for over 200 years. And doing so is not breaking the rules to change the rules. They have been changed before. And it's often done by a simple majority, when the minority is abusing Senate procedure. As Senator Merkley pointed out last week, it's been done at least 18 times since 1977. And contrary to the Republicans' dire warnings, making these changes has never led to the death of the Senate. In fact, the Republicans themselves made a strong argument for such changes back in 2005. They were up in arms. Why? Because 10 judicial nominations had been blocked. 10 now, mind you, 10. That number seems quaint now, but it was enough for the Republicans, and they were very clear about it. That's what the Republican Policy Committee said in 2005. I want to read to you what they said at this time. Quote, "This breakdown in Senate norms is profound. This is now a risk that the Senate is creating a new 60-vote confirmation standard. The Constitution plainly requires no more than a majority vote to confirm any executive nomination. But some senators have shown that they are determined to override this constitutional standard. Exercising the constitutional option in response to judicial filibusters would restore the Senate to its long-standing norms and practices governing judicial nominations and guarantee a minority does not transform the fundamental nature of the Senate's advice and consent responsibility. This approach, therefore, would be both reactive and restorative. Restore the Senate to its long-standing norms and practices. It would be difficult to state the case more clearly. This just isn't about the rules. It's about the traditions and norms of the Senate and their collapse under the weight of filibusters. I know the winds can change, positions can change. Neither side is 100% pure on this. Both sides have had their moments of obstruction, and no doubt their reasons at the time. But I don't think the American people care much about that. They don't want a history lesson. They want a primer, and they don't want a primer on parliamentary procedure. They just want a government that works, that gets things done, period. I came to the Senate in 2009. My position on this has not changed since then. The Senate needs to do its job, and it's missing in action. When we proposed to change the rules at the beginning of the Congress, we were very clear. We called for a talking filibuster. If you want to hold up legislation, you should have to stand here in this chamber on the floor and make your case. We did not intend to trample on the legitimate rights of the minority, and we were willing to live with these rules no matter if we were in the majority or the minority. I do not believe the Constitution gives me the right to block a qualified nominee, no matter who is in the White House. I say that today, and I will say it if I am in the minority tomorrow. A Republican president may have nominees I disagree with, most likely so, but the people elect a president. We only have one president at a time, and they give him or her the right to select a team to govern. If those nominees are qualified, a minority in the Senate should not be able to block them on either side of the aisle. Oversight, yes. Review, yes. But not block because you don't like their policy or their program or the law they are committed to enforce. This is not advice and consent. This is obstruction and delay. New Mexicans want a government that works. The American people want a government that works, and they're tired of waiting. Thank you, Madam President, and I would yield the full floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Tom Udall, New Mexico, the latest senator to come to the floor, speaking about the proposed rules changes, Senate rules changes on filibuster votes. Senator McConnell, meanwhile, a number of Capitol Hill reporters reporting that the minority leader is meeting in Senator Reid's office at this hour, as is White House Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough. Will keep you posted on that. A number of comments, too, on the hashtag C-SPAN chat. Rob says, unfortunate that it's come to this, but Republican obstructionism is unprecedented, and the Senate is now clearly a broken institution. The nominees under consideration that still have yet to see a vote on the Senate floor include Richard Cordray, who is now actively running the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The nominee for Labor Secretary, Thomas Perez, Regina McCarthy for EPA Administrator, Fred Hutchberg of the Export-Import Bank, and 3 nominees to the National Labor Relations Board. It's about an hour left in general speeches till anticipated votes at 5:30 Eastern. We expect a live quorum, a call of senators to the floor at that time. While we are in this quorum call, we're going to show you some of the debate from last Thursday on the Senate floor.
President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 51.
Is there objection? No. I'm sorry. The question is
on the motion to proceed.
the question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it.
I send a cloture motion.
The motion is agreed to.
Thank you, Madam President. I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination. Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, Richard Cordray of Ohio to be director.
The clerk will report the closure motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard Cordray of Ohio to be director, Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, signed by 18 senators as follows. Read.
I ask unanimous consent, Madam President, we not read the names.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I now move.
The motion is agreed to.
I'm so sorry again to interrupt you. I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 100.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination. National Labor Relations Board, Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Richard F. Griffin, Jr. of the District of Columbia to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows. Read.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar number 101.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Sharon Block of the District of Columbia to be a member.
I have a cloture motion, Madam President, at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Sharon Block of the District of Columbia to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent the reading of the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to legislative session.
Question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I now
The
move.
motion is agreed to.
I now move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 104.
Question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
There's a
The
cloture
clerk
motion.
will report the nomination.
Nomination, National Labor Relations Board, Mark Gaston Pierce of New York to be a member.
I have a cloture motion. I would ask the clerk to report if the chair agrees.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Mark Gaston Pierce of New York to be a member of the National Labor Relations Board, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask consent that mandatory quorum under Rule 22 of the Senate be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now move to proceed to the legislative session.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session and consider count number 178.
The question is on the motion to proceed. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Export-Import Bank of the United States, Fred P. Hochberg, of New York, to be president.
There's a cloture motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Fred P. Hochberg of New York to be president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask unanimous consent that reading the names.
Dedicated their lives to serving our country. Among our veterans, I have special admiration for the members of that greatest generation who served during some of our nation's darkest hours and liberated the world from the forces of tyranny. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, more than 16 million Americans answered the call to serve our country, and more than 400,000 husbands, fathers, brothers, mothers, and daughters never returned home. More than 200,000 Kansans served during the war, including General Dwight D. Eisenhower, future U.S. Senator Bob Dole, who will celebrate his 90th birthday on Monday, along with my own 97-year-old father at home in Plainville, Kansas. During the dedication of the World War II Memorial here in our nation's capital, Senator Dole described the greatest generation this way, and I quote Senator Dole: "On distant fields and fathomless oceans, the skies over half the planet, and in 10,000 communities on the home front, we did far more than avenge Pearl Harbor. The citizen soldiers who answered liberty's call fought not for territory, but for justice, not for plunder, but to liberate enslaved peoples around the world." Among those citizen soldiers was a young Kansan named Richard Seitz. When World War II began, Dick was attending classes at Kansas State University, but by the end of the war, he had successfully led his battalion through some of the fiercest fighting of the war in the Battle of the Bulge. Our country lost a great individual, a man, a dedicated soldier, an American hero, when Lieutenant General Dick Seitz recently passed away. General Seitz was born in 1918 in Leavenworth, Kansas, and at an early age he showed great interest in serving his country in the armed forces. In high school, he was the cadet commander of his school ROTC unit, and he received the American Legion Cup as an outstanding cadet. As a young man, Dick attended Kansas State University, and while a student, he accepted a commission as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. While spending a year away from K-State to earn enough money to finish his degree, Dick was called into active duty in 1940. During an infantry course at Fort Benning, Dick witnessed the original parachute test platoon and volunteered to become a paratrooper. He was part of the 6th jump school class ever held by the Army and became one of its first paratroopers. General Seitz rose rapidly through the ranks until, at the young age of 25, he was a major, and he was given command of the 2nd Battalion of the 517th Parachute Infantry Regimental Combat Team. Showing great potential at this young age, Dick was soon promoted to lieutenant colonel. As the Army's youngest battalion commander, he led his men through many historic combat operations in Europe. During the Battle of the Bulge, Dick's battalion and a regiment of the 7th Armored Division formed what became known as Task Force Seitz. Their mission was to plug the gaps on the north slope of the Bulge every time the Germans tried to make a breakout. During the battle, some of the bloodiest fighting in World War II, Dick's battalion went from 691 men to 380. Years later, when asked about the worst day of his life, Dick quickly identified January 3, 1945, during the Battle of the Bulge, when his unit came under heavy artillery fire and 21 of his men were killed. Before shipping out to Europe, and while still a student at K-State, Dick began dating his first wife, the former Betty Merrill. When Dick was called up for active duty, Betty continued her studies at K-State, graduated in 1942, and joined the Red Cross. In 1945, she was stationed in Holland, where she read that Dick's battalion was heavily engaged in fighting around St. Vith. Determined to see him, she drove by herself from Holland to the front in Belgium and managed to find his battalion. She wasn't allowed to go to the front lines where Dick was, but her trip put them back in touch, and 6 months later they were married in France with one Red Cross bridesmaid and 1,800 paratroopers in attendance. Dick spent the next 33 years by Betty's side before her passing in 1978. Together they raised one son and 3 daughters and traveled the world as Dick continued to serve his country. Among his many command posts were the 2nd Airborne Battle Group, the 503rd Infantry Regiment, and the 82nd Airborne Division, which he led into Detroit and Washington, D.C. in 1967 to quell riots. An airborne historian, Dr. John Duvall, said Dick was, quote, an airborne pioneer and one of the fellows who set the standards for what the airborne was all about. That standard continues to be the standard the paratroopers follow yet today. They have bigger airplanes and more complex weapons, but standards were set by them. We have lost a great soldier in Dick Seitz. During his Army career, which included nearly 37 years of active duty, Dick received numerous awards. Because of his great courage and his heroism during World War II, Dick was awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and the Purple Heart. Despite his many accomplishments in the military, one friend said, he remained humble and sincere, often embarrassed by any fuss made over him. He was the kind of person you wanted to be. He was always concerned for others above himself. As a soldier and commander, Dick's philosophy was always to take care of his troops. Throughout his career, he served as a mentor to many other soldiers and leaders in the Army. Retired Brigadier General and former senior commander at Fort Riley, Don McWillie, said, Lieutenant General Seitz showed to me and the entire 1st Infantry Division what it is to be a soldier, a statesman, and a gentleman. Very few men come along who can live as all 3. Dick Seitz certainly did. I will miss him not only because of our friendship, but because other soldiers will not have the opportunity to learn as I did. Our Army, community, and nation has lost a treasure. In 1975, Dick returned to Kansas upon his military retirement, and 3 years later, his wife, Betty, passed away. In 1980, he married Virginia Crane, and together they spent the next 26 years actively involved in the local community until her passing in 2006. Dick was a mentor of mine, a friend, and someone I greatly respected. He not only served our country, but also his state and his community. Dick settled in Junction City, Kansas following his retirement, but he never really retired from serving. He frequently visited Fort Riley to greet deploying and returning units from Iraq and Afghanistan, no matter the hour, day, or night. He was involved in the Coronado Council of Boy Scouts and served on the board of the Eisenhower Presidential Library and was named an outstanding citizen of Kansas. Most recently, General Richard J. Seitz Elementary School at Fort Riley was named in his honor in 2012. Dick was well known to the students and staff because he regularly visited the school. During his visits, he would talk with the students about what it meant to be a proud and great American. And his message was always to respect the teachers and be a learner. His family and friends have described him as a gentleman, compassionate, respected, full of integrity, gracious and giving. He was truly a remarkable individual. His daughter Patricia said this about her father. He was my role model, an individual who had great wisdom, great sense of humor, always interested in others, always looking for ways to help others succeed. Dick lived each day to its fullest, and his commitment to his fellow man serves as an inspiration. Senator Dole had these words to share about his comrades in arms, and he said this, again quoting Senator Dole, "We were just ordinary Americans who were called on to meet the greatest of challenges. No one knows better than the soldier the futility of war, in many respects the ultimate failure of mankind. Yet, there are principles worth fighting for and evils worth fighting against. The defense of those principles summons the greatest qualities of which human beings are capable: courage beyond measure, loyalty beyond words, sacrifice and ingenuity, and endurance beyond imagining. I would say that is a fitting description of my friend, Lieutenant General Richard Seitz. You know, today in the Senate, when we look for role models, when the American people look for something different from Washington than what they usually get, we can look to our military men and women, to our soldiers, to people like General Seitz. Not one individual volunteered or was drafted to serve in the military who did so for the purposes of Republicans or Democrats. They did it because they believed that America was a great place, was worthy of protecting, wanted to take care of their families and its future generations. And Richard Seitz was that kind of servant, something we can learn from this week. I extend my heartfelt sympathies to his 3 daughters, Patricia, Catherine, and Victoria, and to his son Rick and the entire Seitz family. I know they loved him deeply and will miss him very much every day. I hope to be at the funeral services honoring General Seitz on Monday, and I ask my colleagues and all Kansans to remember the Seitz family in their thoughts and prayers in the days ahead. Madam President, I yield. Notice the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas a moment ago, one of the, actually probably the only senator so far to come to the floor speaking on an issue unrelated to the business at hand, which is the upcoming discussion on possibly changing Senate filibuster rules. The Senate will meet in a closed session behind closed doors in the old Senate chamber this evening at 6 p.m. Eastern. And coming up in about 45, 50 minutes or so, votes on the Senate floor. They'll have a live quorum calling senators to the floor. So we will continue live here on C-SPAN 2, of course, covering the debate so far and looking at some of the comments you're making on Twitter. We're using the hashtag C-SPAN chat. Here's one from Evan Gallagher. Senator Udall is right to remind us that both parties benefit from filibuster reform. The Democrats today, but the GOP will tomorrow. Rob says that it's unfortunate it's come to this, but Republican obstructionism is unprecedented, and the Senate is now a clearly broken institution. And from Mr. Speaker, he tweets that, I think the radiation from the nuclear option has warped Senator Reid's sense of reality even more than usual. Again, the hashtag is C-SPAN chat. More speeches expected ahead. Timeline is votes are scheduled for 5:30 Eastern, and that behind-the-scenes meeting, behind closed doors meeting, in the old Senate chamber at 6 p.m. Eastern.
Say aye.
The Senate in a quorum call and about a half an hour away from a vote on a live quorum calling senators to the floor. They will meet this evening behind closed doors in the old Senate chambers to discuss proposed changes to Senate filibuster rules regarding nominees. Corey Bowles from the Wall Street Journal writes that the fight centers on whether senators can use filibusters to slow and potentially block nominees to cabinet agencies and other executive branch slots. Invoking a filibuster forces a nominee to win 60 votes in order to shut down the filibuster, a harder target than the 51 votes needed for confirmation. It is a tactic, writes the Wall Street Journal, used most often by the Senate's minority party, currently the Republicans. So again, 5:30 Eastern is when we expect the live quorum, and the behind closed doors meeting at 6 p.m. Eastern. Senator Reid, the majority leader, started his day speaking at the Center for American Progress in Washington, saying Republicans can avoid a change in the Senate filibuster rules only if they confirm the 7 presidential appointees they've been blocking, and saying in his comments, quote, "Right now the Senate is broken and it needs to be fixed." We'll show you the majority leader's comments as this quorum call continues.
Well, thank you all very much for being here this morning. I know it's always appropriate to start your presentation by saying something funny, and I'm about the most unfunny person you've ever known. But I thought I would tell you something that happened to my family not long ago. As you know, I have 5 children. My youngest boy has 4 little girls, and they're beautiful little children. He was a gifted athlete. He was our entertainment till he was 22 years old. Played on 3 national championship teams and at the University of Virginia, and he was so looking forward to coaching his boys so they'd be just like him. But he's got 4 girls. So he's coaching them. They're all very athletic. But his lovely wife and he decided it would be a good thing if their kids, the 4 little girls, had some responsibilities around the house. And so they sat down with all 4 of them and said, okay, we're going to give you this much money every week, but you're going to have to do, they outlined what they had to do. Help with the dishes, pick up toys, help with the beds, make up the beds. Just do a list of things that kids are always required to do. And it went just fine for 3 or 4 months. But Ella, the oldest, for a while just wouldn't do anything. So her mom talked to my son, and she said, when you get home, you're going to have to sit down and have a little talk with her. She won't do anything. It's been that way for weeks. So my son sat down, and just the 2 of them alone, and started what he thought would be this long conversation with little Ella. And he said, your sisters are doing everything they're asked to do. You are basically not carrying your load. Why? What's the matter? She said, Dad, I don't need the money. Well, at least a few laughed anyway. Well, I appreciate very much for having the opportunity to visit with each of you on something I've worked on for some time now. John, I appreciate very much the work of having this organization. For 10 years, Nara, you're doing a great job filling in for John. Congress is extremely unpopular for a couple of main reasons. Any poll you look at indicates that they're unpopular for 2 reasons. 1, gridlock. Gridlock, gridlock. 2, not getting things done. And that's really true. When I came to Congress, well, actually the first time I ran for the Senate, we were above 45%, approaching 50% Congress. Not that way anymore. Last Gallup number had us at 10% and not going up, going down. So why is that? Of course, we all know we need to pass legislation that does good things for our country, especially the middle class. Flip on C-SPAN, as I know some of you do, and what do you see there the vast majority of the time? Nothing. Blank screen. Quorum calls. So we're wasting time, hour after hour, day after day. I'm trying to give you a picture where we're coming from, me and my caucus. Lyndon Johnson was Majority Leader for 6 years. During that period of time, he had to overcome one filibuster. I've been leader about the same time as he has. I don't know the exact number, but it's around 420 filibusters. So things change, yes, they sure have changed. Now, everyone knows that under the Constitution, we have a responsibility to give advice and consent to the President on his nominations. But all we have from the Republicans is not advice and consent.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise, I should ask consent first to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. I rise this afternoon to talk about one of the aspects of the debate that's occurring, has taken place over a long period of time now, but especially today when it comes to Senate rules and what's happening on nominations and confirmations. One major aspect of that debate relates to the National Labor Relations Act, an act passed in the 1930s. And I wanted to start today by highlighting what one of the findings was that undergirded was one of the foundations of that act. In the mid-30s, because of labor strife and because of the conflicts between management and labor, people in both parties came together and said we had to put in place legislation to deal with that, or we couldn't have the kind of growing economy that we would hope to have. One of the findings, it's the third finding in the 1935 Act, says as follows: experience has proved that protection by law of the right of employees to organize and bargain collectively safeguards commerce. Safeguards commerce. I repeat those words. And it safeguards commerce from the following: injury, impairment, or interruption, and promotes the flow of commerce by removing certain recognized sources of industrial strife and unrest, by encouraging practices fundamental to the friendly adjustment of industrial disputes arising out of differences as to wages, hours, or other working conditions, and by restoring equality of bargaining power between employers and employees, unquote. So says one of the main findings of the 1935 Act. There's an additional finding that speaks to it from the employer's vantage point, how it's important to the free flow of commerce to have disputes settled. So that's where we started in the 1930s. And from that day forward, decades now of work and practice, you've had labor management disputes settled and determined by use of the procedures in the National Labor Relations Act. Obviously, fundamental to that was the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB. So says the acronym. But here we are, and we don't have, as of just a number of weeks from now in August, we will not have a functioning board because of the conflict here in the Senate about this issue and because of the debate between intra-session appointments and inter-session, meaning appointments within a session of the Senate as opposed to an appointment outside from one session to the other. I'll talk about that in a moment, but I wanted to highlight one of the real-world consequences of this. Sometimes we have a lot of debates around here, and they tend to be a little theoretical, a little removed from the reality of life. Here's a real-life story of how these appointments matter. Marcus Hedger. Marcus Hedger was illegally fired in 2010 from his pressman's job at an Illinois printing company for his union activities. And last September, a unanimous National Labor Relations Board 2 Democrats, 1 Republican at the time, ruled that he should get his job back with back pay. Aren't many disputes settled here that are unanimous. But that hasn't happened yet. That's 2010. The NLRB decision in Hedger's case has been vacated because of the Court of Appeals decision regarding, as I mentioned before, these recess appointments. And Hedger has lost his house in the meantime. Here's what Marcus Hedger said, and I think we should all listen and act upon these words. And I'm quoting him now. So almost 3 years later, I still don't have my job back, even though the National Labor Relations Board unanimously ruled that I should get my job back. I'm asking the United States Senate to do what's right for the people who gave you the power to represent them and to confirm the bipartisan package of nominees to the NLRB so that other workers can have their rights protected, just like the NLRB tried to protect my rights, unquote. My rights meaning the rights of Mr. Hedger. That's what he's telling us to do our jobs. Now, don't have time today because of the limitations of time that I have here, but there are stories as well that speak to this from the employer side. Listen to this one headline involving Walmart. Walmart. Headline reading earlier this year, a Reuters headline, January 31st, 2013. Quote, Walmart protesters will stop picketing after reaching deal with NLRB, unquote. So you have a board which for decades has functioned helping to resolve disputes, sometimes to the betterment or the advantage, really, of one side versus the other, but settling those disputes nonetheless. Now, there's a lot of attention paid to what I would call kind of the inside baseball of this. It's about the difference between intra-session and inter-session. But here's the record. Here's the record, despite what some in Washington have asserted. Here's the record going back over many presidencies. Just give you 4 presidencies by way of example. This idea that you cannot make an appointment during an intra-session, within the session of the Senate. President Carter made an intra-session appointment to the National Labor Relations Board. President Reagan made 4. Okay? President Clinton made 2. President George W. Bush made 4. 4 intra-session appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. And since President Reagan's first term, more than a generation ago, since President Reagan's first term, in addition to members of the appointments made to the board, the NLRB, hundreds of other recess appointments have been made so-called intra-session. Okay, so the idea that this is somehow a new development really does not bear the scrutiny of the record. So I know we're out of time, but I rise today to remind us what this board has meant to this country, and I read that first section principally to highlight the fact that they're mentioned twice there, the flow of commerce. This isn't an act that says this act is to promote one side versus the other. It's all about the flow of commerce, the movement of goods, economic activity, so we can keep the country moving. Obviously, in the past, when there was unprecedented strife, you would have whole lines of production or whole sectors of our economy shut down because we didn't have a National Labor Relations Act and because we didn't have a National Labor Relations Board. So I end with this. I end with the words of Marcus Hedger, who has suffered mightily. First, he's discriminated against. Okay, that's adverse to his life and his family. Then when a decision is made in 2010, the decision is meaningless so far to him because he hasn't been granted the remedy, and he lost his house in the meantime. Here's what he said, and I'll end with these words. Quote, companies should be able to get away with firing someone just because they stood up for their rights. That's un-American. We need a functioning National Labor Relations Board to protect us and our rights, unquote. That's what Marcus Hedger said. We should bear in mind those words. Get the job done. Get 5 people who are before the Senate voted on and confirmed, so we can have that free flow of commerce and provide a remedy for people like Marcus Hedger. I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from South Carolina.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to honor the memory of 9 South Carolinians lost last week. The McManus and Antonakis families, both of Greenville, were vacationing together in Alaska when a small plane they were flying in crashed on takeoff. Millet and Kim raised 3 beautiful children, Olivia, Mills, and Anna. They were close friends with Dr. Chris and Stacy McManus and their wonderful children, Megan and Connor. The loss of these 2 families has left the upstate grieving, including the congregation of Christ Church Episcopal, where more than 1,200 people attended a memorial service last Friday. When you talk to folks in Greenville about the McManus and Antonakis families, a few words come up over and over again: faith, character, kindness. Despite the heartbreak we feel, the Greenville community can hopefully take solace that these 9 friends, 9 neighbors, 9 brothers and sisters in Christ are now in a better place. We remember them not for the tragic way they died, but for the joy and compassion with which they lived. Thank you, Madam President. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate gavelled in this afternoon about 2 p.m. Eastern. Mostly this afternoon, general speeches about the debate ahead on changing Senate rules regarding votes on filibusters, the so-called nuclear option. A vote is expected at 5:30 Eastern.
Who is in charge of the clattering train, the axles?
Senator, we are in a quorum call.
I'm sorry. I asked unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And asked unanimous consent that I speak for less than 10 minutes in morning business.
Without objection.
Who is in charge of the clattering train, the axles creak and the couplings strain, and the pace is hot and the points are near, and sleep hath deadened the driver's ear, and the signals flash through the night in vain, for death is in charge of the clattering train. That's a poem from the 30s that was quoted by Winston Churchill in his book, The Gathering Storm. And, Madam President, I rise today in the wake of a terrible tragedy of a clattering train where death was in charge, one that left more than 60 people missing, 20 confirmed dead, and has devastated a community. But despite the magnitude of this amazing loss, it's also a story of human heroism at its highest level. I'm referring, Madam President, to a horrific accident that occurred early last Saturday morning when a 72-car train carrying crude oil derailed in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, near the border of western Maine. As the train erupted into all-engulfing flames, it came crashing into the town, demolishing everything in its path. Cars and buildings were instantly incinerated, pavement on the roads literally melted away, and sidewalks crumbled from the intense heat and pressure. As a result, nearly a full 6 city blocks were completely leveled, forcing almost 2,000 residents to flee their homes, a third of Lac-Mégantic's total population. And, Madam President, while local Canadian firefighters battled the flames valiantly, and I mean valiantly, it became clear that they desperately needed support. So after receiving a call at 4 a.m., 30 firefighters from Rangeley, Farmington, Phillips, Strong, New Vineyard, and Chesterville, all wonderful small Maine towns, as well as the town of Eustis, arose from their sleep, rushed to their engines, and drove 83 miles nonstop, arriving at 6 a.m. to help extinguish this horrendous blaze. And it's worth noting, Madam President, that except for the chief, every firefighter who made this journey and put their lives at risk, every single one that morning was a volunteer, serving and risking their lives of their own choice and volition. And upon arrival, their efforts had immediate impact. They quickly realized that there was a desperate need for water. And because the town lacked a hydrant system, they swiftly turned their attention to a lake 3,000 feet away and began to pump water using an extraction skill that Maine firefighters are specifically taught and trained to use. They continued to pump water from that lake for 21 straight hours. Mr. President, let's put that in perspective for a moment. For almost the entire next day, those brave men and women, driven by an incredible spirit of perseverance and self-sacrifice, worked tirelessly to extinguish the blaze and gain control of the burning train cars. Fire Chief Timothy Pellerin of Rangeley Station said everyone was hugging and cheering to celebrate their miraculous success when the fire was brought under control. It was like a ball team after a win, he said, and the Canadians, overwhelmed by the selflessness and courageousness of those volunteer Americans, thanked them for their steadfast determination to see the crisis through. Residents of Lac-Mégantic and local firemen were coming up to one of the Rangeley fire trucks, asking to have their picture taken with the American flag attached to the safety bar and pausing to touch it as a sign of their respect and gratitude. After returning home late Sunday afternoon, Chief Pellerin said he has never been more proud to be from Maine or from America and to be a firefighter. We still don't know the full scope of the devastation wreaked by this gruesome event. The cleanup and recovery costs will undoubtedly be astronomical, as well as the traumatic impact on the community upon which no dollar estimate can be placed. Initial reports indicate that at least up to 1.2 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the streets, basements of houses, storm drains, and contaminated that nearby lake. Currently, over 200 criminal investigators are sifting through the charred remains of what might be North America's worst railway disaster. And I sincerely hope that through their efforts we will be able to better understand the causes of this horrible tragedy and perhaps, more importantly, how it can be prevented in the future. But, Madam President, my real reason for rising today is to honor those volunteer firefighters from Maine, true American heroes who embody the best this country has to offer. They were called into action by their unwavering sense of civic duty. And throughout the night, they overcame tremendous odds, including a language barrier and a lack of resources, to finally help extinguish the fire early Sunday morning. These brave Mainers showed true strength of character that enabled them to overcome fear in pursuit of the greater good. It is without a doubt that their actions saved countless lives, and we owe these American heroes our enduring gratitude. My thoughts and prayers remain today with those who are impacted by this tragic event. To go back to the words that Churchill quoted so long ago, who is in charge of the clattering train? The axles creak and the couplings strain and the pace is hot and the points are near and sleep hath deadened the driver's ear and the signals flash through the night in vain. For death is in charge of the clattering train. Death was in charge of the clattering train that dark night, but the perseverance, skill, and courage of those firefighters from Maine and their brave Canadian counterparts could not prevent a tragedy, but at least contained and controlled it. Madam President, this is the best of America. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Last Thursday, Majority Leader Harry Reid filed cloture on 7 nominees, including Richard Cordray to head the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Gina McCarthy to head the Environmental Protection Agency, and 3 appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. Votes to end debates on those nominees are expected on Tuesday. A vote coming up in about 5 minutes, a live quorum to bring senators to the floor. And Matt Vasile-Gambros from National Journal writes that in rare circumstances, the Majority Leader can request a live quorum call because he actually wants all senators present for debate. If a majority of senators are not present in the chamber, the Majority Leader can make a motion which would direct the Sergeant-at-Arms to request the presence of absent senators. So we expect that in about 5 minutes or so. Then, at 6 p.m. Eastern, the Senate will meet in a joint caucus behind closed doors in the old Senate chambers. You're watching live Senate coverage here on C-SPAN 2, and we'll show you some of the comments of lawmakers and others on Twitter this afternoon.
and say aye. Ms. Bowman. Mr. Brooks. Mr. Bowles. Mr. Baggage. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blount. Mr. Burns. Mr. Brown.
Don't do anything.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
The clerk will call the names of the absent senators.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Vitter, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden.
Instruct the Sergeant Arms to request the presence of absent senators.
The question is on the motion.
Ask the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second on the yeas and nays? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll on the motion.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman.
Bless you.
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr.
Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates,
C-SPAN 2's live coverage of the developments from the Senate floor as we continue to watch the vote from the U.S. Senate. Again, all of this in anticipation of a meeting that will take place, scheduled to get underway in about 20 minutes inside the old Senate chamber. Earlier today, the Senate Democratic leader Harry Reid said that unless Republicans allow votes on 7 of the president's pending nominees, he will trigger what we've been debating and discussing here in Washington, the nuclear option. This would change the rules to get some of these nominees through the U.S. Senate. Right now, the Senate is scheduled to begin vote tomorrow on some of these nominees. First up for consideration will be Richard Cordray. He is the president's pick to head up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. His nomination has been pending for more than 700 days, according to Senator Harry Reid. After that, Democrats will proceed to 3 nominees to the National Labor Relations Board. And again, tonight's meeting, which is rare because it's not often that they meet inside the old Senate chamber, a chance for the senators to talk to each other. No cameras allowed in the room. And we'll get a sense from 2 former members about what to expect in just a couple of minutes. Again, Senator Reid appearing earlier today here in Washington, and he talked about one of those nominees, the president's pick to head up the Environmental Protection Agency, Gina McCarthy. The entire event is available on our website at cspan.org. We'll also show it to you here on C-SPAN 2, but here's a portion.
As we know, Frank Lautenberg passed away very recently. He was a fine man. He loved the Senate. Gina McCarthy, after her 1,100 questions were answered, the Republicans refused to have a single Republican attend. So the only way to overcome that is all Democratic senators of the committee had to be there. Frank Lautenberg was dying. I called Bonnie and I said, we have to have him here. And he literally on his deathbed came down here, unhooked the stuff that is keeping him alive, came down here from New Jersey and walked in to make a caucus of. Everybody was there for the Democrats and the EPA committee. And we shouldn't be doing stuff like that. That isn't what it's all about. You can't reward bad behavior over and over and over again.
Senator Harry Reid at the Center for American Progress earlier today explaining the possibility of the nuclear option. And joining us live on the phone is the former Republican leader of the U.S. Senate, Trent Lott of Mississippi, joining us here in Washington. Senator Lott, thanks very much for being with us.
Glad to be with you again, Steve.
You have been the majority leader, you have been the minority leader, so you can look at this from both sides of the perspective. Explain the frustration that Senator Reid is now facing and also the options for your colleague, Senator Mitch McConnell.
Well, I understand the frustration, and I felt it when I was majority leader, and I felt it when I was minority leader, because you want to try to get things done. You want to get nominations confirmed. I was very anxious to get some federal judges confirmed, which the Democrats blocked with filibusters, and you get frustrated when you're trying to move the legislative agenda along. In fact, the biggest problem the majority leader has in the Senate is time, because he or she has to keep in mind that if he calls up a bill or a nominee that's going to be filibustered, it's going to take time to break that filibuster, or if you have an objection to go into conference, it takes a lot of time. So it's very frustrating, and I understand that. And I was tempted to try to change the rules and on more than one occasion. But I think they're doing the right thing by going into the old Senate chamber, which has a lot of history and a certain aura about it. On 3 different occasions when I was in the Senate, we went into the Senate, old Senate chamber, when we didn't know what the result would be, and we were looking for a process to get out of a fix. One of them was how to proceed on the impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton. Another involved the Chemical Weapons Treaty. And so it makes you sort of settle down and really listen to each other and talk to each other. And I hope they'll find a way to avoid pulling this nuclear option trigger, because it is a slippery slope. The Senate is unique. It's painful, it's troublesome, but it's unique, and there is a reason why things are difficult, and you have to take time to listen to the other side's objections. There are very clear objections and understandable problems with some of these nominees, but and for instance, every one of Obama's cabinet secretaries have been confirmed as the nominations. They've moved, over 1,000 nominations. There are a few of them that were problematic, but without trying to second guess either party or either leader in this particular fight, my advice would be to find a compromise, find a way to avoid this. I was involved in that process the last time we got very close to the nuclear option back in 2005, I believe it was, and we worked it out through a process that was kind of difficult, but we got it done. And I hope that Majority Leader Reid will listen to the options, and that the Republicans will understand his frustration, and that they'll find a way to avoid doing this. Because if you can change the rules with just 51 votes instead of the 67 that the rules really require, then you could change anything. Yeah, it may apply only to executive calendar this time, or executive nominations, but it could be judges next time, or it could be legislation after that, and then the Senate would just be a mini House.
I want to come back to that point, Senator Lott, but to give our audience a sense of just how rare this is, you were in the House of Representatives the last time the Senate made changes back in 1986, and they've made cloture vote changes 6 times since 1917, the last time 1986. So that gives you a sense of just how rare this is.
It is very rare, and in my time, I was in the Senate 19 years. I actually employed this tactic one time, and it was really kind of backed into it, and I realized after the fact that I shouldn't do that, and the next day I reversed the precedent that had been set, just requiring 51 votes instead of the supermajority, which it's not in the Constitution. It is a Senate rule, but it is part of the history and the culture of the Senate, of what it is, and it also forces members of both parties to come together and try to develop a consensus, not only on legislation but on nominees. The Senate has a unique responsibility in advise and consent under the Constitution, something the House does not have. And every now and then, the Senate is going to decide that a nominee of the president is a problem, not done legally, or has problems that they cannot accept, and they should be able to block or reject those nominees.
I want to remind our radio audience that we're talking with Senator Trent Lott, former Republican senator from Mississippi and the former Majority and Minority Leader in the U.S. Senate. Have you had a chance to talk to any of your colleagues in the last couple of days or couple of hours? What's going on behind the scenes?
Well, I have had some communications with some of them on both sides of the aisle, just because they know that I went through some of these things and got very close to doing the nuclear trigger one time, and but worked with a number of people to come up with a compromise of how we would not do it. And so I've had a couple of them call and said, now, what did y'all do in 2005 to avoid the so-called nuclear option? How was it set up? And part of the problem with these compromises is sometimes they kind of go around the leadership. But sometimes the leaders, because of their positions, can't get out front and trying to develop a compromise. So it's one of those occasions where other members need to step up and say, no, we're not going to agree to this, but we're going to make some compromises here. There's going to have to be give on both sides of the aisle. That's really what life is all about. Life is about not always getting your way, but life is about being fair and allowing both sides of an issue to be heard, and then trying to find a way to work through it. And we've kind of lost that a little bit in Washington these days. Again, I'm not blaming the president necessarily or either party. It's just a fact. But we got to rise above partisan politics and try to decide what is best for the institution and what is best for the country.
Senator Lott, we're watching the senators as they gather on the floor of the U.S. Senate, and they will walk shortly to the old Senate chamber. Give us a sense, 10 minutes before this meeting is getting underway, what do you think is happening right now?
Well, I think that it kind of is a sobering thing. when senators assemble and in the Senate chamber, and then they walk as a group, commingled between Republicans and Democrats, into the historic old Senate chamber. And when you walk in there, you think about the great men and women that served there. You think about the great debates between Henry Clay and Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, and it just makes you stop and think a little bit about, okay, look, this institution is unique, as designed by James Madison. There was a reason why it was created the way it was. Do we want to take a step here that will maybe pull us away from the uniqueness, or can't we find some way to work this out? And in the past, when we've gone in the old Senate chamber, we did that. I hope and pray that tonight they will come up with the right solution for the country.
Can I ask you, have you been talking to either Senator Reid or McConnell about all of this?
I don't want to be in the stands throwing rocks or saying who I've been talking to, but obviously I have a very good and fond relationship with both of them, and I do sometimes communicate with them indirectly, sometimes through the South, sometimes just emails. So, but I don't try to, I try not to give them advice unless they ask for it.
Final question for you, Senator Lott. What do you think the outcome will be tonight, and how long will they meet this evening?
I would expect they'll be in there a couple hours, and Senator Reid seemed pretty determined this morning in his remarks, but I know there are some on both sides of the aisle that are saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to do this. And the odds are someday the Republicans will be back in the majority, and maybe there'll be a Republican in the White House, and you wouldn't want then the next step to say, okay, we're going to apply just 51 vote to judicial nominations, or maybe then do away with filibuster altogether. So I think there's a chance that they'll come out with some way to avoid a real blow-up, which could have real negative effects on the ability of the Senate to act in important areas and complicate things as they move into the fall.
Senator Trent Lott joining us live on the phone. He served in the U.S. Senate from 1989 until 2007, formerly also a member of the House of Representatives and part of the Republican leadership. Senator Lott, thanks for adding your perspective to our program today.
All right. Thanks a lot, Steve. Bye-bye.
By the way, a reminder, you can join us on Twitter as well. The hashtag is C-SPAN Chat. And one of our viewers also sharing a comment, as the president governs more by fiat and board rule, the more important it is that we filibuster. Join us at C-SPAN Chat. We'll share more of your comments coming up during the course of the afternoon and into the evening. Again, a live coverage from the U.S. Senate. Earlier today, Senator Reid speaking here in Washington about the nuclear option and his frustration over a number of nominees, including some of the president's choices to serve on the National Labor Relations Board. Here's more with Senator Reid.
McConnell has made clear that the recess appointments are what he's most concerned about, and you have the vote set up to start with Cordray with a procedural vote tomorrow. Are there any circumstances under which you would see delaying that, maybe to have additional talks? How ironclad is a vote tomorrow?
Talks on what? Talks on what? Talks on what? If they have a proposal, bring it to me. But otherwise, we're going to have a vote in the morning. If they have a proposal, bring it to me. The easiest way to do away with this is to simply get rid of these filibusters. I mean, what logically, why would they hold up? This is one of the most interesting things. They created these recess appointments. We didn't. They created them. They wouldn't allow us to have these people. What is Barack Obama supposed to do? The NLRB goes out of business August 1st. It's gone. It's over with. And they're using, I've heard it, oh, you're doing this illegally. Well, it's only happened because of them. The President wouldn't have recess appointed these people. Now, with these courts, what they've done, they said, you cannot have a recess appointment. Basically, period. That's it. It's gone to the Supreme Court. We don't have time to wait and see what Justice Kennedy's going to do. Maybe we should just call him.
The Senate Democratic leader, Harry Reid, this morning at the Center for American Progress, his speech and the comments on the nuclear option, why he would invoke it, and explaining his own frustrations in dealing with his colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle. And you're watching the scene from the floor of the Senate as lawmakers continue to gather in preparation for the closed-door meeting in the old Senate chamber. Let's watch for just a moment.
Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Vitter? No.
Again, if you're wondering what's happening, this is a motion to instruct the Sergeant at Arms to request attendance of absent senators for the closed-door session inside of the old Senate chamber. And joining us is no stranger to the U.S. Senate. Senator Byron Dorgan served 18 years, Democrat from North Dakota. Joining us here in Washington, Senator Dorgan, thanks very much for being with us.
Happy to be with you.
How did we get to this point in the Senate?
Boy, I don't know. I was just, I was listening to Senator Reid in your clip. I mean, you can hear the frustration in his voice, and I understand the frustration because for the last 4 or 5 years that I served in the Senate, things were vastly different than the way the Senate normally was supposed to be working. And it's just complete gridlock. The system is broken, and on these issues of nominations, I mean, we got people waiting 2 years who've been nominated who have not had a vote, and so. It's a mess. The American people look at it and say, can't you figure out a way with goodwill to sit down and reach agreement on some of these things?
And yet Senator McConnell says that we've already approved more than 1,500 of the president's nominees. What's at issue today seems to be these executive nominees for EPA, for labor, for the NLRB position. Can the Senate just limit it to those positions in changing the rule and still function as we've known it over the last 200-plus years?
I don't know. I mean, the nuclear option is called nuclear, but because it's a big step. But, I think the threat to do this by Senator Reid is probably the only thing that brings everybody to the table. I noticed that they're going to meet this evening in the old Senate office, the Senate chambers. I was trying to recall, I think the last time that happened was during impeachment, the impeachment resolution for President Clinton. It's a very unusual step to get all 100 senators in the old Senate chamber. And, maybe with the doors closed and they start thinking through and talking through this, they'll understand that there's got to be people of goodwill who will decide, let's get back to some regular order and do what the American people expect of us.
I'm going to ask the same question I asked Senator Lott just a short while ago as we watched these senators gather from the Senate chamber. What do you think is happening? What are they talking about, and what do you think the atmosphere will be like inside the old Senate chamber when the doors close within the next 10 to 15 minutes?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of tension because, people understand that this is a significant moment. Changing the Senate rules in the middle of a Senate term, that it's a big, big deal. And if it happens, there will be retribution, I assume. I mean, it's hard to see how the Senate will be in worse position because they can't get much done now. If you're a senator now and your nourishment comes from accomplishment, you're starving. I mean, there's nothing happening up there that is particularly good. And so my hope is in that chamber, they'll start talking to each other, not through the press, but standing up at their desks and talking across the aisle. And they may come out of there with a determination to try to do better. That certainly ought to be the case.
But let me go back to my earlier point, Senator Dorgan, because in your lifetime you've seen the Vietnam War, you've seen what happened during the Watergate crisis, you've seen what happened with the impeachment of a president. What is different today that would force the Senate for the first time since 1986 to potentially make changes to the rules?
It's just, it's sort of like the chain came off the bicycle here. I mean, it just is broken. It's not working. And it's not just the Senate. I mean, across the country we have these strong feelings on each side where in the old days the lubrication of democracy is called reaching across the aisle and compromising. Now compromise is a four-letter word, and people in both caucuses that reach across the aisle are, sort of seen as people that are not standing for their principles. Well, that's absurd, but that's kind of what's happened, and so the result is the caucuses sort of lob grenades back and forth at each other. But look, I understand why Senator Reid is pretty frustrated. The fact is it's been very hard to get anything done, not just nominations. nominations, but we've seen, with all due respect, Senator McConnell and his colleagues have required cloture petitions. They've filibustered even motions to proceed on non-controversial bills. Why? To obstruct, to stop things from happening. Well, they've been successful at that, but the American people, I don't believe they think it's much of a success for the country.
But, Senator, having served in Congress, and let's take the hypothetical that if the nuclear option is invoked and the majority will rule, not the 60 votes required, could that turn the Senate into another House of Representatives?
It could. It sure could. I mean, this is not a free vote for anybody. This is a consequential action, and my hope would be that this group that meets tonight will decide they'll resolve this issue. They're all United States senators elected in their own right. My hope is they come out of that old Senate office, or Senate chamber rather, and decide they don't have to take action, that they'll reach some agreement to protect the Senate's prerogatives and to do the Senate's business. That's what the American people pay them to do, and it's what they expect their representatives to do. One final point. I served with a lot of people over the years in the House and in the Senate, and I tell you what, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, really unbelievably qualified, interesting, thoughtful people, I mean really terrific people that serve in the Congress. And yet somehow, some way, they get there in a caucus and the question becomes, whose side are you on? Well, there really ought to be only one side. I'm with the American people, I mean, that's what the answer ought to be. Instead, it's kind of retreating to caucuses and lobbing grenades, and it's just not working.
It's now 1 minute past 6 o'clock, and the session inside the old Senate chamber is scheduled to begin this hour. As you can see, senators are still gathering from the Senate floor. No cameras allowed inside the old Senate chamber, and we're talking to former Senator Byron Dorgan, Democrat from North Dakota. Have you had a chance to talk to your colleagues over the last couple of days, and if so, what are they telling you?
I haven't over the last couple of days. I've obviously been in touch with some of them over the weeks and months. Nothing much has changed. They're very frustrated. All of them, I think, are pretty frustrated about things. They understand the American people. Polls show the American people give them very, very low ratings. They don't like that. I think all of them would prefer to be on a different course, but none of them, or I guess not enough of them, can find a way to get on that course. So maybe this is the kind of unusual step, meeting at 6 o'clock at night in the old Senate chamber. Maybe this is the kind of unusual step that requires a different kind of approach by both caucuses and by individual members of the Senate. Maybe they'll think through the traditions, the responsibilities, and really the grand place in which they work. It's supposed to be the great place of debate in America, the floor of the United States Senate. Well, it certainly has not been that in recent years, and it ought to be restored to that.
And, Senator, what about your former colleague, now President Barack Obama? We know that White House Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough has been meeting with Senator Reid. What is the White House role in all of this?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what role, if any, the White House has. There's separation of powers, as you know. I mean, there's communication, I'm sure, back and forth. But the president, I'm sure, must as well be, and I know he is because I've talked to the president from time to time, he's very frustrated because, he was elected president. He has a right to put together his team, his cabinet, to have the key people appointed, nominated, and then confirmed by the Senate to run these federal agencies. And it's been very, very difficult because particularly in the Senate, speaking now, the confirmation process has been really hampered by the minority in the Senate. And so I understand why the president is very frustrated as well, because government isn't working the way it should. Well, I heard Harry Reid mention one of the agencies where people have waited 2 years, to get confirmed and still aren't confirmed. I mean, that's an example, I think, of the frustration at the White House of what has not been happening in the Congress.
And yet we've heard from Republicans who have said that if the nuclear option is in place, according to Senator Mitch McConnell, it would poison the relationship in the chamber and the GOP would block any legislation until 2014.
Well, that's probably the case, and it would be the case even without the nuclear option. They're blocking major parts of legislation for the administration, and so I do think it. Will it poison the well? Some, sure, but is the well full of clear drinking water? Absolutely not. I mean, the Senate's just not functioning the way it should, and this may be a wake-up call this evening, even though it's at 6 in the morning or 6 in the evening, I should say. Maybe a wake-up call to every senator. You know what? Things have to change, and maybe they have have change starting now.
It sounds as if you don't miss the U.S. Senate.
It was the privilege of my life serving there, but I was in Congress 30 years, and I decided I wanted to do some other things, and I'm doing that. I miss going to a vote and seeing all my buddies, but I regret that the fact it is not the kind of Senate it used to be, where serious issues were treated seriously, and you had significant debates that resulted in the best of both parties rather than the worst of each.
Byron Dorgan is a Democrat from North Dakota. He served in the U.S. Senate from 1992 until 2001 for 18 years. Senator, thanks very much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
I'm happy to do it. Thanks a lot.
By the way, again, you can join us on our Twitter page. The hashtag is C-SPAN-Chat. You're watching live coverage from the floor of the U.S. Senate. We'll listen in for the next couple of minutes in anticipation of the senators about to leave because they are scheduled to go to the old Senate chamber this hour.
Is there any senator wishing to change his or her vote? If not, the ayes are 69 and the nays are 28, and a quorum is present.
Madam President,
Majority Leader?
as unanimous consent, we now proceed to period of morning business. Senators be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to consideration as Res 195.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 195 to authorize testimony and representation in the matter of the proposed discipline of Laura Bloch Lauer.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motions to reconsider be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask consent the appointment at the desk appear separate in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent when the Senate completes its business day today at recess till 10 a.m. on Tuesday, July 16th.
Without objection.
At 10 a.m. then, Madam President, Senator-elect Merkley will be sworn in as new senator. There's no further business come before the Senate. I ask that it adjourn recess under the previous order.
Senate stands in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. I think there was